introibo ad altare Dei.
Welcome to Catholic Conversations. This is Adrian Fonseca. I'm here with my, we'll say friend, Joseph Aquila. Hi, Joseph.
Hello, Adrian. I appreciate such an honorable title.
I know, everyone, I'm just really popular. I can only have so many friends.
It's a real joy to be here with you. I'm so glad to be able to participate in this Catholic conversation.
Hey, you asked me. No, okay. So
I felt pursued. I mean, I really did. Took some wooing, but I finally agreed.
So, Mr. Aquila here is a self-proclaimed Catholic politician. What did you say? An expert in, not politician, expert in Catholic politics, or what did you call yourself?
I'd say I'm an autodidactic Catholic political philosopher.
Oh, okay.
Amateur right now.
And what is that word you just said?
Autodidactic.
Autodidactic. Oh, it's a fancy way to say that I don't actually know what I'm talking about.
That's essentially what I'm hinting at. So, like, if I mess up or say something wrong, I'm like, oh, I'm not an expert. You can't quote me on that. I'm just wrong. So that's my way of covering myself.
Okay. So what's your background?
So I graduated from the University of St. Thomas last year, May 2018. My major was in international studies. So that was kind of where I did. It's a social science, but I focused on politics, specifically Middle Eastern politics.
Why Middle Eastern politics?
Because I was interested in the idea of a society that was not influenced by Enlightenment kind of ideals and philosophies. So kind of my way of taking a look at what a modern society would look like without the Enlightenment principles guiding it. But I also had a minor in philosophy and a minor in theology. So, I tried to balance myself out and not be too social science-y.
Okay. So then you mentioned Enlightenment philosophy. Mm-hmm. So what would you define Enlightenment philosophy? Because Enlightenment philosophy I see is typically distinguished between, like, you have the Enlightenment in France, and then some people will date another one as in prior to that. So how would you define Enlightenment philosophy? I
mean, you can argue about when the actual Enlightenment philosophy began, but it's the concepts and the ideas about personhood, the role of the state. They're kind of, it's clear what concepts emerged. So I would say you find kind of, this is a very unpopular opinion, but the Florentine humanists in the 16th century, give or take, were already advancing ideas that about personhood and kind of the sanctity of the person, almost independent of any kind of religious. They did a good job of joining religion and humanism, but that, you kind of see the seeds of that already in Florence. But really, it's Enlightenment comes with the you have Descartes with his reductionism and kind of the dualism of mind and body, and in England you kind of have their own separate Enlightenment. So all these philosophers advancing ideas about where does the power of the state come from, where does the role of church and state, and ultimately you arrive at a kind of nation-state idea with personal autonomy being kind of primary and reason breaking in and, saving people from the darkness that is the Roman Catholic Church. Thank God for that.
Yay. And congratulations. We have modernism.
Exactly.
Okay. So then what is Catholic politics? How on earth do we as Catholics look at politics?
Well, I can only offer my own opinion here, but I think that one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this was because I think that especially in America, we are so heavily influenced by classical liberalism that, and really Puritanism and Protestantism, it's so imbued in our culture and our Constitution that it's difficult for so many Catholics to even arrive at a view of politics that isn't in some way influenced by Protestantism or the kind of liberal the liberal project, as it were. From
So what is the worldview of Protestants versus Catholics that make it different?
Protestants value, they see that it's possible to live a good life, to live a Christian life, almost independent of the state. So that's why you kind of have views about like Locke and Hobbes. Those are kind of the founders of modern liberalism, with their thinking about how the individual is sovereign and the rights of the individual, and that the role of the state can be primarily defined in negative terms. So, I mean, if you look at our Constitution, all of our rights are defined as negative rights of the state, right? So the state can't prevent you from, saying what's on your mind. It can't prevent you from, freedom to assemble and all these kinds of things. So the whole idea of the Constitution, of our Constitution, is framed in a negative rights kind of way. So the state itself is kind of, its duties are very minimal. And basically, it's to stay out of people's business and let people live their own individual lives, and everything will be kind of hunky-dory.
Okay. And then the Catholic view would be, I guess, positive rights?
Yeah, that's one way of looking at it. I think there's a lot of different kind of theology that are very nuanced, so I won't get into the minutia of those different positions. But essentially, you have this in the Catholic view, based on like Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum, or later Quadragesimo Anno, these papal encyclicals which talk about what the duty of the state is, in terms of like, mostly that's in terms of social and economic life. And there you have the promotion of the state as not just this thing that keeps people secure and like kind of provides a social contract, but rather something that helps develop the individual and helps develop the family to promote a flourishing society. And so what we can gain from those and even earlier works is the question, what is the end of the state? What is the telos? What is the whole purpose of the state?
And so by end, you don't mean like a finish line. You mean like like a final goal. What is it?
The Aristotelian end, as it were.
And so the idea of what you're just saying is the idea of subsidiarity and solidarity, correct?
Well, yeah, those are the principles that guide the Catholic social thinking.
So what are those for people who don't know?
So the Catholic social teaching is guided by four basic principles, you can say. The sanctity of human life, the principle of subsidiarity, which is solidarity, I think, actually comes first. So the principle of solidarity, subsidiarity, and the promotion of the common good. So they kind of build on each other. It starts at the individual, the sanctity of human life. Then you move to solidarity, which is the kind of the community, the importance of the individual units of society, which are usually the family and the community. And then subsidiarity, which is the idea that if something can be done on a local level, it shouldn't be done at a higher level. Like, for example, that's why you deal with roads, for example, in the city at the city level, rather than having like the state government get involved, because the state doesn't know the city as well as the city government would. So that's kind of subsidiary. And then last, you have the common good, which encompasses everything, right? So you have that kind of start with the individual, move to the community, move into the various levels of the community, and then lastly, the common good, which encompasses the entirety of it.
So it sounds like if you follow the first three, the common good comes naturally.
That's the idea, I think.
Okay.
But you already have to have an idea of the common good in order to work toward it. And that's what I think that why Catholic political philosophy is so important, because ultimately what Catholics should be looking for is a state that facilitates the end of man, which again, like the goal of man. What is man's purpose?
All right, let's talk about that then. What is the end of man? What are we geared towards?
The beatific vision.
The beatific vision. And so everything we do should be geared towards what? The salvation of souls?
Precisely, yeah.
So how does a state work towards that goal?
Well, the purpose of the state then is to aid man in the attainment of his goal, right? So that means promoting, the dignity of human work, promoting the family, promoting the community, helping to develop these aspects of society which aid man in his goal of attaining the beatific vision, right? So if you have a society which is, for example, like, if you have laws banning pornography, for example, right? It helps us lead a more virtuous life because we're not as inundated with sexualized images, or even laws just saying that man has to have a livable wage. These things which help promote the family, because if a worker can work and receive a livable wage, then he can spend time with his family rather than having to work 3-4 jobs, which promotes family life. So these things which people don't necessarily think of as being necessary for the state to do, if you have a Catholic understanding of the goal of the state, it is the role of the state is to help people develop, and that encompasses all aspects of life.
Okay, so that makes sense. So the problem I have, though, is in an American idea.
What's new, Adrian?
I know. So the American idea, and so I agree with you that the end of man is the salvation of the soul, or the beatific vision. And I would also love it if we could direct our state to the flourishing of man in that way. But since we live in America, what is a practical way we could do that? Because it seems as though we couldn't even argue under the government we live in today to do something like ban pornography.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. And I think there's a lot of different things that we can do. But first and foremost, it's, as an individual, live a good Christian life. That's what ultimately what we're called to. I thought it was kind of funny, back in 2015 when the Supreme Court handed down the case that legalized same-sex marriage, because it was like everybody in the United States was freaking out. And I was like, same-sex marriage is legal in most countries. I mean, just because America did it doesn't mean that suddenly the world's going to end. Yeah, it's like, it's not a great thing, sure. But we need to stop being so thinking that just because America did it, then suddenly God's going to smite the world. I mean, realistically, the way to change something like that isn't to fight. I mean, we've kind of lost the culture war in that sense.
So you think the culture war is already done? We can't. There's no winning it back.
I think there's some battles that are worth fighting. But if you're, like you just mentioned, I mean, if we're just yelling at each other and talking past each other, there's no culture war that we're going to have a chance of winning. And that's why I think fundamentally we, as Catholics, we need to first understand what is our faith, and second, live out that faith at an individual level. Get to know your neighbor, get to know the people around you, get involved in your parish, in your church, in your faith community, because those are the areas where you can actually begin to build a society that looks Catholic, and that's one thing I think that Catholicism is kind of, and at least in the United States, we're not very good at.
So you're saying don't worry so much about the state of the government and worry more about your neighbors and how you are dealing with life around you.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely battles worth fighting, at the legislative level. But I think what can an everyday Catholic do? I mean, that's live your life according to Christian principles and according to the one true faith, as Holy Mother Church proclaims it, because that's when politics and culture are dynamic. They feed one another. There are certain cases where a change in legislation shapes the culture, but there's like with the Oberfeld decision in 2015, that's where culture shaped legislation realistically.
So then, in that case, we have where do we stand in terms of what battles are you saying is worth fighting for and what battles are not worth fighting for?
I think battles have to be fought on multiple fronts at the same time, right? You can't just win minds. You also have to win hearts. And I don't like, personally, I don't like the idea of arguing for certain moral positions purely on a secular level.
So you're saying so it sounds like you're saying, I don't think this is what you're saying, but it just sounds like you're saying that we shouldn't legislate morality.
Well, I just said that the state should guide human flourishing.
Right.
So in some ways you have to legislate morality. No, I think that there are definitely circumstances where the legislation has to be you have to say this is what I believe ultimately is the true end of man, and this legislation will help him will contribute to the common good and ultimately help man achieve that end. But there are certain things, like for example, you can't really realistically make contraceptives illegal. Or you could make them illegal, but that's not something you could enforce because that would involve banging down people's bedroom doors and seeing what's inside. And that's something that the state just reasonably can't accomplish. So you can legislate morality, but if you really want the culture to reflect it, you have to win both the hearts and the minds of people.
So you're saying we should meet people where they're at and accompany them on their faith journey?
No, I think that we should present an authentic view of. We should present the truth, and one thing is people can get obsessed with one thing, especially like abortion, or they can get upset that the Catholic Church doesn't do this one thing, or that.
Well, I would argue that there's some issues that are objectively more pressing, and things like abortion would be more pressing than maybe some other issues.
I'm thinking more along the lines of, like, if you wanted to look at it this way, you kind of have in the United States this split where there are a lot of Catholics who are on the left, right, and their main focus is social justice, right, and they only talk about social justice, and that's why then kind of like what we might call conservative Catholics look at that and they're like, see, they're only talking about this. Where's the tradition? Where's the magisterium? Where's the doctrine? And then on the other side, you have the conservative Catholics who are only talking about tradition and, maybe even like Latin liturgy, which the people on the left are like, you're not paying attention to the message of Jesus Christ. And so you kind of have these sides which focus on these kind of one aspect of Catholicism.
I don't know if I agree, though, because I find it that it's usually not always, but usually the case that most people that are more traditional Catholics also care about the social justice aspect of it. It's really the traditional Catholics who are praying outside of abortion centers or going volunteering at soup kitchens. I mean, it's not always true, but from my experience, and it's anecdotal, is that it's usually the traditional minded people who tend to do the work of Christ because they believe that the work of Christ, of the corporal and spiritual works of mercy, are mandates. And so that's what I find. Is that not what you find?
I would say that you can find instances of it. I mean, I'm not saying that traditional Catholics don't do those things or aren't concerned with social justice, but that's not the emphasis that they place. And they can be much more legalistic than might be maybe social justice Catholics, if you want to call them that. And that, in part, I think that's kind of what Pope Francis is. A lot of what he's doing is in response to a kind of legalism which he sees, in terms of how they're not. I mean, certain Catholics aren't willing to meet people where they are at, and they'll like, okay, this is. They lead with the wrong foot, if you will. They can kind of leave behind a joyous disposition, and you can, like I said, you can find instances of Catholics working in the soup kitchen, sure, but what is their primary concern? I would still hold that it's making sure that Catholic institutions remain Catholic by teaching the teachings of the faith, and that the liturgy remains traditional, which are all great things. Me. I'm when I first met you, you were like, I invited you to the Latin Mass, and you were like, oh, I'm not going to that. And
you invited me to a Latin Mass?
I invited you to Latin Mass.
I don't remember
when
that.
you were a freshman or something. I was like, Adrian, you should come to the extraordinary form mass. And you were like, oh, no, I'm not going to do that Latin stuff.
Well, I believe that. I believe I did that.
Yeah, no, that happened. So, I mean, that I'm not at all opposed to those things. But kind of on the opposite side of things, the social justice Catholics, if you want to call them that, are their primary emphasis is on the corporal works of mercy, but the language with which you might view them as two sides. With the language with which they address each other is kind of talks past each other, and you don't really see an integrated Catholicism.
Yeah, I think the integrated Catholicism is Mother Teresa. Because Mother Teresa, if you read her writings, her letters, she really talks about how the whole point of the corporal works of mercy, the reason why she would go out and feed the poor and take care of those who were sick, is solely because she wanted the salvation of their souls. Mm-hmm. And so she was like, but they can't think about religion if they're trying to figure out where they're going to eat.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think that's a really good example. I was thinking of Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic Worker Movement. She was obviously big social justice person, but the writings on the importance of the magisterium. I mean, she didn't mince words. She was definitely going, you follow the church or extra ecclesia nulla salus. I mean,
now that's controversial.
She was much more gung ho about that, which is kind of But I think St. John Chrysostom said something. I might be butchering the quote, but if you can't see Christ in the poor man at the door of the church, how can you see Christ in the Eucharist? And I think that's an important thing to remember. And that's why I think, there needs to be that integration. There's a polarization which didn't exist in early Christianity.
So where do you think that came from?
Me, I'll have to blame the Protestants.
I tend to agree. I pretty much date most of the not all, but most of the problems around 15, 17-ish.
I mean, you do have the problem of hyper legalization. I mean, there were definitely clerical abuses. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say that medieval Europe medieval Christendom was perfect.
Of course not.
Not by any stretch of the imagination, really. But I think there may have been a loss in popular piety, that piety became something that was popular. There wasn't. When I studied abroad in Ireland a couple of years ago, and I was talking, there were actually some Nashville Dominican sisters who ran one of the parishes in Limerick, and I was talking to one of them one day, and we were kind of talking about how the people in Ireland are still very much remember, pre-Vatican II, the way of doing things. And their prayer life revolves around doing the rosary and going to Mass. And they don't really know how to pray outside of that. And that's, if you don't have I think the cornerstone of the Catholic faith is ultimately a relationship with Christ. An encounter, as Pope Benedict says, it's an encounter with the person of Christ. He says that at the beginning of Jesus of Nazareth, and I think probably in a bunch of other places too. But it's an encounter with the person of Jesus Christ. So if you don't have that as the foundation for your faith, then it's going to be a weak faith because you don't have the cornerstone of Christ. And so I think Catholicism Western Catholicism did overemphasize to a certain extent the formulaics and lost a sense of mysticism.
And so let's go back to talking about politics. In terms of politics, what are the different ways that we can talk about politics as a Catholic?
That's a good question. I mean, the different ways you could talk about it is not so much as don't debate positions necessarily, right? Which is, you don't want to say this policy is terrible. No, this policy is terrible, right? You kind of want to get what's underneath those positions and talk about what do you see as the common good and what do I see as the common good and how do we achieve that? Ultimately, what do we want out of our political system? And that's why, I mean, I can only speak anecdotally on this, but I see a lot of Catholic libertarians, and I don't necessarily see libertarianism as compatible with a
because
Catholic.
libertarianism, I would argue, is very individualistic.
Oh, absolutely.
And therefore, wouldn't that be not just not compatible, but incompatible? Like just
Contrary,
like the contrary,
you might
yeah.
say. Yeah. I have quite a few Catholic libertarian friends, so it's
I thought it was hilarious because you accused me of being a leaning libertarian, and I was like, I would not consider myself leaning libertarian.
I did accuse you of that, yeah.
And I'm like, no, I'm much more into a Catholic monarchy or something like that. Very contrary to libertarianism.
Well, it is. Yeah, monarchy certainly is. I mean, the hyper-centralized government would probably be the best way to achieve a Catholic integral state. But I mean, but
not practical.
No, yeah, perhaps not in our current climate. And I think that just the way that we, like I mentioned before, the way we've been influenced by kind of Enlightenment ideas, we can't help it. Our instinct politically is to be. Government should stay out of my business, especially because Catholics have been a minority in this country for a while. And so
a state government didn't lean in our favor.
Exactly. So we haven't been exactly partial to the government getting involved in a lot of things. So that's, I mean, one thing is like, okay, we want freedom of religion because we want to be able to be Catholic and not Protestant.
Right.
So we're hyper in favor of that. But if you, read earlier saints, they're not necessarily in favor of freedom of religion. It's a very liberal idea, but our instinct as Americans and as people who grew up in a liberal tradition are freedom of religion is one of the most important rights.
Yeah, because as Americans, it was either freedom of religion or we're going to be some sort of Protestant.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you had that when Maryland was established. I mean, that was the first Catholic state because Catholics were fleeing England. They didn't want to stay there. They didn't want to be Anglican.
That's right. Why would you want to do that?
Because they're wrong.
And so whenever we would talk about a two-party system in America today, we only have two parties. And the Catholic ideology, the Catholic teaching doesn't line up perfectly with either party.
Absolutely.
So what can we do?
I mean, one of the good things about the American system is it is you can vote on the individual candidate. So, and like in a European parliamentary system, when a candidate from a particular party is put in the parliament, they kind of they have a lot more incentive to vote along party lines. We have that in the United States, right? A Republican is usually going to go along with the other Republicans.
Typically.
Yeah. But you have a little bit more leeway.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things where it's like, in terms of like voting, for example, or who you promote, look at the individual, right? Because you have pro-life Democrats.
That's right. Yeah.
And you have pro-choice Republicans. It's
not too much anymore. It's kind of become more polarized.
The Democrats
nowadays.
used to be the majority of Catholics used to vote Democrat because there were a lot more pro-life Democrats. But now because the issue of life has become such an issue, more and more Catholics have gone to the Republicans.
And less Democratic politicians support pro-life.
Oh, absolutely.
So now I don't think there's a single one on the ballot who supports pro-life anymore.
In the presidential ballot?
No, I'm talking in these. Definitely the presidential ballot for Democrats.
I think there's a few congressional.
Is there a few?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think one from Michigan or something.
So yeah, I think it's funny because people always say like, I'm just a Republican. I'm like, I'm not a Republican. I'm Catholic. I vote Republican because it's either that or people who are pro-abortion. So typically, conservative ideology leans more into Catholic teaching in general, but it's not perfect. Mm-hmm. And so,
I would say conservative ideology leans into Catholic teaching on social issues.
Yeah.
And if you study political science, then most of the time they'll tell you that Republicans and Democrats are split along an economic line, right? Democrats are for more government involvement. Republicans are for less government involvement in the market. But Catholics, if you read the social teachings, should be socially conservative and economically liberal, and using American political terms. Mm-hmm. We were the Quadragesimo Anno in the 1940s. I think it was the 1940s. Correct me if I'm wrong. maybe earlier, 1930s.
I don't know.
It was 40 years after Rerum Novarum. But I mean, that's basically, in that, the Pope is condemning unfettered capitalism and socialism. He's saying these are two, both do not give the proper respect to the human person. They can both lead to basically immorality, and capitalism can lead to people being enslaved to consumerism, and that being the driver, and socialism can lead to totalitarianism. There's other, obviously, elements to it, but that's both of these extremes are not something that the Catholic Church would endorse.
So what about religion in school and things like that? So this is the idea of separation of church and state. We shouldn't teach religion in school, that kind of idea. How do we respond to that? Should we put our kids in public school systems, or should we just be like, screw public schools? We're going to all Catholic schools. We're going to homeschooled, and or should we try to bring God into the public school system?
Well, as you know, I was homeschooled, so I can't speak about the experience of being public schooled, even private schooled. But I had an interesting discussion about public education policy a few days ago with a friend of mine, and he was saying, and I agree with him, we were talking about Catholics kind of, when they realized that the public school system wasn't necessarily favoring their worldview, we kind of cut ourselves off and started, private schools and homeschooling. It's complicated because you're in favor. I'm in favor of things like parish schools. Yeah, I think that the more elements of the community that can be part of the parish, the better. But on the other hand, if you're a parent who can't afford to send their kid to the Catholic school, but you want your child to receive Catholic education, the primary place they're going to do that is at home, and then they have to go out into the world. And if Catholics keep removing themselves from the public sphere, there's not going to be anybody there to teach about Catholicism. There'll be no one there who understands it. And you'd be surprised by how many people just don't know what it is they're talking about when they talk about anything Catholic.
Oh, no, I would not be surprised at all.
I mean, the questions that I get, it's dumbfounding. I mean, sometimes
it's like, you don't know who Jesus is?
Yeah, I mean, it's like,
oh no, the one I get all the time. Jesus was a Jew?
The Romans killed Jesus, and now they're it's the Italians' fault. But no, I think there's something to be. I like speaking in generalities because
you don't want to be specific.
You can spend your whole life trying to work out a specific issue. But because I do think things are dynamic. If you change one thing, then everything else will be influenced. So, you want the good of a Catholic community attached to a church, sure. Or I went to St. Thomas High School in Houston, which is a good Catholic school. So you want your kids to be formed by priests and in that way. But on the other hand, you don't want to cut yourself off from the public sphere. Because then when your child leaves the home, that's where they leave the faith in a lot of ways. Every day from 8 to, 4?
Yeah, I think last time I checked, I would think it was 70-something% of people who would leave the Catholic Church will leave before they turn 21.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think fundamentally the formation of the faith happens at home. But if that's all that if it can't happen, I mean, every situation isn't ideal, so it can't always happen at the home. But if they're going out into the public sphere and all the other Catholics have retreated to the Catholic schools and Catholic.
All right, so tell me though, if you had how many people in your family, and how many siblings do you have?
I have 10 siblings,
and you're number
8.
So you're number 8 out of 10 siblings. How many of your siblings have left the church after being homeschooled?
0.
Well, then it seems like homeschool might be working.
Homeschooling is it can work for specific people. I mean, the beauty of homeschooling is that the parent is the primary educator, right?
Mm-hmm. And isn't that the ideal?
It is the ideal, but it's not. It's the ideal that the child is first educated in the home. But
primary,
the primary education. So you're being shaped not just in you don't learn practical subjects necessarily in the home. You learn I guess you might consider this practical. You learn truths about the faith. You learn how to be moral. You're formed by your parents. You learn how to contribute to society, and so you learn the things that make you a good person. But your parents can't necessarily. I mean, my mom couldn't teach me like calculus 1. You know, she went to college, but that was only so much she could.
Yeah, I mean, I'm currently in college, and I can't teach you calculus 1.
Yeah, I mean, it's not exactly the easiest subject. So there comes a point just practically where you can't homeschool everybody.
Right. So I know personally who I've gone to Catholic school most of my life. I went to public school for a few years, but most of my life I went to private school. And I have a ton of friends who went to a private school with me, and they left the faith either soon after or relatively soon after. I mean, it's only been 3 years since I've been out of high school, and I already have a couple of friends, or quite a few friends, that have left the church. In fact, I think it would be a cool idea to bring one of them on and talk to them about why they left. Yeah, so I might do that later.
I think the reason for that can kind of be laziness.
Yeah.
Because as I mentioned, if a person is being taught primarily that the Catholic faith is going to mass, saying the rosary, or doing these devotionals, which are great things to do in the foundation for any solid faith, the source and summit of the Christian life, as the Catechism says about the Eucharist. If that's all they're doing, though, if they're never taught the importance of what they're doing, or that this is all founded on the person of Jesus Christ, then you kind of left with a bunch of empty movements to the person. There's objective grace that happens in these things, in the rituals of the Catholic faith, but if the person is not engaged, if they don't see as themselves as being having a personal stake in it, then how can you expect them to?
There's this really good book. I don't know if you're familiar. It's called Insinu Jesu. Are you?
Oh yeah, I've heard of that.
Yeah, so it's pretty recent. It's about a private devotion of a Benedictine monk who was praying in adoration, and he received interior locutions of our Lord speaking to him. And I think that is something that we should foster in people, a devotion to adoration, because it does everything. I think it accomplishes what you were talking about, because you have the source and summit of the faith, the Eucharist, there present. Of course, you're not receiving the Eucharist, but the Eucharist is present there, body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. But then it also has the private element of it, of being able to sit there with our Lord and speak to him personally, using your own private devotions, whether that be the rosary or whether that be just you journaling or writing or speaking or however it is that you pray. I think that it incorporates it well together. Yeah,
absolutely. And actually, that's a really good point, because it makes me think also of the importance of mental prayer in general. We don't know how to be quiet in a lot of, we always want to be going. We don't want to be bored. And people think that sitting and praying mentally is boring. And if you don't foster an interior life of prayer, then, everything else, what else can you base it on? All of the great saints they all have their devotions. Sure, they all have an amazing interior life of prayer.
Yeah, I've been trying recently, personally, to try to get into more private silence and meditation, because I know for me it's very difficult, because I grew up, especially at church, there's not silence at all. At most of my parishes growing up, even during Mass, there'd be music playing constantly during Mass. There'd be no silence. They would split up the choir so that way they could make sure that half the choir was receiving communion, half the choir was still singing, and then they switched. And I'm like, oh my goodness. And so all I hear is it's always noise all the time. And so I think that is something that we have lost. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, it was Blaise Pascal who said that all the world problems could be fixed if man could learn to sit alone in a room in silence.
Yeah. Exactly right. I think it's sitting. There's always noise. Even I was thinking to myself that I kind of had one of the opposite problems. As I left university and started professional work, I'm going, all day corporate America, and I find it difficult now to make sure that I'm taking time because there's always something that needs my attention. But if you can't rely on the moments of silence, how can you hear God? Because we know from Scripture that God's not in the whirlwind, He's not in the hurricane, He's in the whisper and the wind. And so, how can you hear God if everything is always a hurricane? And so, without that interior life, it's difficult to want to engage in your faith. It's difficult to see any meaning behind our rituals and in the devotions that we have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point because I feel like that's a very American thing. Is the rustle and bustle of daily life is always being busy.
Yeah, people. I'm sure you're familiar with the book "Leisure: The Basis of Culture."
No, I'm actually not.
Oh, So, "Leisure: The Basis of Culture" was written by a philosopher named Joseph Pieper.
Oh, okay, yes, I'm familiar with him, but not the book.
So he wrote that book post World War II, and kind of envisioning what a society, as they rebuild Europe, what a society would look like. And his argument is essentially that the basis of culture is not work. That's communism, right? If you view man as just a worker, or of course, work has dignity. But if you use the primary end of man, view that as work, then you're going to end up with communism. But alternatively, the end of man is consumerism. You're going to end up with unfettered capitalism.
Right.
So leisure allows man. Leisure is not like sitting around and lying around, but it's doing the work of contemplating God, of encountering reality, of encountering the beauty of the world, and allowing these things to present themselves to you. But you can't do that if you don't have the time to be in leisure.
I was reading John Paul II's book, Gift and Mystery, in celebration of his 50th anniversary as a priest. And in it, he is talking about how his life, every single action of his life was geared towards his vocation. And one thing that he talked about was his time under Nazi Germany. And he was working in the quarry. And he realized, he wrote this poem and he shared it in the book. And he said, and basically what he says is that he realized that it's not the work that makes the man worth anything. It's not the work itself. It's the interior work of man that gives him dignity, and the interior work of man that is important and is the most important part. And I thought that was interesting, especially for someone who was forced into labor and was constantly working. In fact, he said he had great Thanksgiving for a lot of the people who he would work with because they would take parts of his shift so he could study and so he could read in preparation for seminary, in preparation for his priesthood. And so he was able to have that leisure time, that time away from work.
Yeah, people underestimate that. We say leisure, but leisure is work. They underestimate just how difficult it can be to take the time to develop your spiritual life, to develop your interior life, and that in itself is, that's the best way to kind of tie this all together again. That's the best way to achieve a Catholic society, is to make sure that you take the time to build up your interior life so that you can live your daily life as the best. To the best of your ability as a good Catholic. And that is how, if every Catholic did that, that's how a revolution would happen in terms of just what society would look like.
Yeah. The idea that what you're saying, leisure is not sitting around and binge watching the entire season of Punisher in 2 days.
Yeah,
I say that because I binge watched the entire season of
maybe
Punisher.
We're not the best people to be talking
about. So yeah, maybe not. I may be a hypocrite, but I'm aware of it.
Do as I say.
Yeah, do as I say, not as I do. Amen. But yeah, and so I thought that was interesting to think about, and I really like what John Paul II has to say about that. It's very interesting. Since we have the idea that leisure is good for us, is good for a man, flourishing a man, how can we gear our lives toward that as Americans? Because I know we often are like running around trying to work 3 jobs and go to school and do all these things in order to quote unquote survive. Though I don't think anyone is surviving in America.
Well, maybe
But-
just surviving.
yeah, just surviving. But how do we foster this idea of leisure? How do we celebrate this?
Take feast days seriously.
Whoa,
Yeah.
that's interesting. Tell me, how do we take feast days
I
seriously?
mean, this isn't original. This is from Pieper, but
I know, I'm sure. Oh no, trust me, I don't believe that you have any original ideas.
Anything intelligent I've said is from someone else. But yeah, I mean, he says you take on feast days, following the liturgical calendar, take the time on those days to have leisure. Sunday's a day of rest. It's a day of leisure. It's the Lord's Day, the day we contemplate God, the day we attend Mass, the day we spend time with our family. And not just, that should happen every Sunday, but, on the great feasts, Easter, Christmas, but not even those. In Italy, you have a devotion to like St. Joseph, for example. In Latin America, it's Our Lady of Guadalupe. These cultures can be based around this feast, but we don't necessarily always give it. We can have these huge celebrations around it because they developed culturally, but we still don't understand why. Mm-hmm. We just know that now on the Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe we have Mexican food. That's how we celebrate this day. And it's like you want to take the feast days seriously because these are days that the church has designated as being you're not supposed to fast, you're not supposed to make reparations. These are joyous days, and these are the days that you take leisure.
Yeah, like St. Vincent Ferrer, who was huge into penance. He would sleep on the floor, he'd scourge himself, and he wouldn't eat, except he would always eat on Sunday. It'd be the only day of the week that he would eat because he was. I know, right? Because he said it was not right for him to
Absolutely.
Fast on Sunday.
Yeah, I mean, you could say it's almost a sin to it's over scrupulosity,
right?
If you think that your way of doing things is better than what the church has prescribed,
right? Because the teaching of the church, namely the Ten Commandments, says keep holy the Sabbath. Well, in Catholic tradition, and keep holy the Lord's Day.
Yeah,
because Sabbath is Saturday. That's another thing that people freak out about when I say it. I'm like, y'all know Sabbath is Saturday, right?
Yeah,
and the Lord's Day is Sunday. There's two different things, and they're like, what? The Sabbath is not Sunday? So I'm probably going to get people upset that I said that the Sabbath is not Sunday.
A quick Google search will clear up why that was moved. I don't think we need to get into it on this.
No, I just thought it was funny because that just reminded me of that. But yeah, so you wanted to talk about a very specific, Mr. I want to talk about generalities. There is a specific Catholic philosophy, political philosophy that you wanted to mention.
Yeah, I would not self-identify as adhering to this, but there is I guess a rebranded group of Catholics who the philosophy they advance is called integralism.
That's how you pronounce that,
or integralism.
See,
actually.
I thought it was integralism.
No one's actually quite sure how to pronounce.
Oh, okay, okay.
But all the ways I've heard, it's usually integralism.
Okay,
but yeah, that's if you look at that term, I mean, different groups have used it different ways, but kind of as I mean it, and it's kind of resurfaced. It started out being called Catholics are calling themselves illiberal Catholics, right, as opposed to liberalism, right?
Interesting.
So,
okay,
so you'd be identifying with the roots of the faith before Enlightenment philosophy, essentially. But so integralism is basically a way they would fall under the umbrella of illiberals, but we wouldn't want to identify as illiberals because Thomas Aquinas tells us that liberality is a virtue. So you don't want to be illiberal because then you'd be unvirtuous.
I think we just have a bad taste in our mouth for the word liberal in America today.
Yeah, we don't understand where these terms come from.
Right. We've redefined every single word possible.
If you understand classical liberalism, you realize that both Democrats and Republicans are very liberal.
Yeah, we need to figure out, we need to define our terms better.
Absolutely.
So, integralism.
Yeah. So, it's basically the idea is that, as we mean it, that the common good is the duty of the state. Kind of what I said at the beginning. The duty of the state is to advance the common good of man. Man's ultimate end is the beatific vision, and so the state's job is to facilitate that end. That being said, the temporal power should subordinate itself to the spiritual power, which in this case is the church, in order to achieve that end. Because if man's ultimate end is not temporal, clearly we should make ourselves subservient to the end, or to the authority which is not of this world. So you're basically saying that the state should abide by Catholic principles, not insofar as they're Catholic, but insofar as you would say that the Catholic principles are true. And that's ultimately what you're trying to get at, is a true vision of human nature and the end of man. And so the state should be facilitating legislation and programs and a society which aids man in achieving his goal, namely the beatific vision. So some people would say that the state should make Catholicism the state religion. You don't have to go that far with integralism, but the state should abide by the principles of the faith.
But I can go that far if I want to.
You could go. I mean, you want to make a Catholic monarchy, so you can take it that far if you'd like to.
In an ideal world, in my Thomas More's utopia world, but you got to work with what we got.
It doesn't have to be the ideal world. Jesus Christ is sovereign King.
Amen. I love Poland because the official queen of Poland is Our Lady. Isn't that awesome?
Wow.
It's so dope. I was like, let's do that in America. The official queen of America, Our Lady.
The liturgical side of me is also kind of sad because we lose out on awesome regal masses. Like we can't say masses with the royal family because we're a democracy.
Oh, darn it!
But actually, it was interesting. Robert Bellarmine, the Saint Robert Bellarmine,
Mm-hmm.
he was one of the
Jesuit,
first,
right?
Yeah,
Jesuit.
One of the good ones.
Yeah.
He was one of the first people to advance the idea that power of the state doesn't come directly from God; it comes from the consent of the governed.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and but that's how he uses that, because he says because the power of the state comes from the consent of the governed, namely a temporal power, it should be subservient to the church, because the church's authority comes directly from God.
And so Bellarmine was what, 1600s?
Yeah.
And
he died in 1621.
Okay. Yeah. And so the medieval idea of politics was that that there was a divine right of kingship.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And so that shift happened. When did that shift happen? Was that?
I mean, that's around the Enlightenment. I mean, the 1600s is about when you start having your.
But you were saying that Bellarmine predated.
He's one of the first to I would say first Catholics to in Catholic political philosophy to present that view.
Interesting.
And it kind of you see the reformulations of it in social contract theory in Hobbes, for example, later on. But if he's packaging that idea in a purely Catholic way, because he's saying this is only temporal. Politics should be subservient to the spiritual good, which the church has directly from God as that spiritual authority. So that's he's saying that I think it's Romano Guardini who said that in the medieval era people were immoral. Yeah, politics was immoral, but they knew they were being immoral. Politicians knew that they were being immoral. Nowadays, God's out of politics, and politics is the highest good, and they don't care if they're being immoral anymore.
Well, I would argue that it's not that they don't care that they're being immoral; it's they don't see themselves as being immoral.
Yeah,
they see it as what they're doing is good.
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, they don't see any kind of negative consequences to acting in a selfish manner.
Right.
That's Machiavelli for you.
Oh, really? Is that where that comes from?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of when you're talking about Machiavelli, you're talking about politicians who will do anything to achieve political power, and that's the beginnings of the end of any hope for a Catholic state, because if people and politicians are only out to attain power, then they're not actually interested in the common good and doing what's right for the members of the community.
So you think we should just stop having campaigns and just be like, all right, you're going to be the politician, just force someone into the position?
I mean, there's nothing wrong with well, I mean, that's not bad. Democracy is the democratic process can be good because you have the people who are who come from the community in theory, who are members of the community, who know the community the best, and can say, I have these different ideas. Because you can argue about the different ways to achieve that common good, right? A specific policy it's neither immoral or moral. It's like, how does this policy affect the overall common good? whether or not you have 3 months of summer break versus 2, right? That's not an immoral or moral position, right? But
right.
that affects how the common good is viewed.
I would argue that we need more summer, objectively speaking.
You would as a student. You're still in university.
Okay, so I have one question, and then if the answer is no, then we'll move on. Have you read the book The Catholic Republic?
No.
All right, we're moving on. I'm reading that right now, and I may give it to you, tell you to read it, and then bring you back on to talk about it, because I have some interesting opinions about it. I don't know how I feel about it yet. I kind of like it. We'll see.
Who's it by?
It's by Timothy Gordon. But yeah, so anyways, last thoughts. We have 5 minutes left. So any last ideas, topics, or anything like that?
Well, this is kind of like a big thing to bring up at the end, but the whole thing that turned me on to viewing political philosophy and Catholic political philosophy specifically was when I read Patrick Deneen's article in 2013, Unsustainable Liberalism, which is, and he basically advances the idea that liberalism doesn't have any positive principles of its own, and the only reason it survived this long is because it's founded on Judeo-Christian values, right? The sanctity of human life is a Judeo-Christian value. Really, I mean, it comes from Catholicism. Liberalism doesn't really, like, it took that from Catholicism. So you're saying kind of like, here's a crude analogy that I'm thinking of. It's like that America is a train and it's running off of the smoke of the burned up Judeo-Christian values. And then once that is all finished burning up, then we have nothing left. Yep. That's basically it. Cool. Not cool, actually. It's pretty terrible. That's not cool. We live in America. Yeah. So you're saying that. So what you're saying is what I'm trying to figure out is that we as Americans have abandoned Judeo-Christian values, and because of that, we are running on fumes. Well, I would say we haven't abandoned them, because if we had, then we would have collapsed. We still hold on to certain ideas. We just don't know where they come from. Oh, okay. And we can't, it's kind of like how we were talking about how we're influenced by liberalism and kind of the American tradition. Right. That tradition is rooted in Catholicism, whether it knows it or not. But as like principles like tolerance, the human person, the individual, these ideas are taken to their logical conclusion, they slowly push out the Judeo-Christian values because it's necessary to do that. Logically, right? If you're going to hold certain principles, you have to push out other principles. So it kind of reminds me of Sam Harris. Do you keep up with Sam Harris? Yeah, every now and again. So he has this strange idea of the Judeo-Christian values. He keeps with almost all Judeo-Christian values, but he says that they just came out of the ether, basically. Oh yeah, I don't think you can have a coherent morality without God. Right, and so I think that his way of speaking reminds me of what you were saying, because he's like, yeah, I mean, these ideas, we do them because this is the culture we're in, and it doesn't have anything to do with God. But what you're saying is that if with that mindset is eventually you take all of these ideas and you take them to their logical conclusion without God, and it always leads in the wrong direction. Yeah. Okay. I mean, people like Sam Harris always debate people who don't know what they're talking about for the most part. Like they take the Protestant fundamentalist who has these really extreme opinions and they say, oh, let's debate. Of course they're going to win. Oh my gosh. The first time I ever heard a quote unquote professional debate was Bill Nye was debating a Christian fundamentalist. A creationist. That was the first one I ever heard. Bill Nye has like a master's degree. Does he have a master's degree? He is barely that. Like, I thought his highest degree was a bachelor's in engineering. Maybe you're right. I think, but I just remember it being him not qualified to speak on half the issues he does. It's ridiculous. And so I remember listening. I was so upset because I was like, this guy doesn't know anything. Like not Bill Nye, the creationist. Yeah. It's like, why is he debating this guy? This guy's literally arguing that the earth is like 5,000 years old. It's embarrassing. And I was like, that's not a fair representation of Christianity. Absolutely not. So that's how they do it. And that's how they win. Yeah. It's really annoying. Yeah. Anyway, any last words, last thoughts? I think the most important thing, as I said, is every individual to live the best Christian life that they can live, and that's how you achieve the closest. That's how you achieve the beatific vision
Do you have any contact information that you would like to give out? If not, you don't have to give out any personal information. But
I mean, if people would like to continue a conversation like this, I'd be more than happy to. I mean, you can give my email address is josephaquila98@gmail.com. So that's JOSEPHAQUILA98@gmail.com.
Awesome. All right. So thank you very much, Joseph.
Thank you for having me, Adrian.
Awesome. So don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. Many people try to figure out how on earth do I subscribe to this podcast? They're just like, can you just send it to me? And I'm like, no, I can't send it to everyone. So the subscribe on any place that you listen to podcasts. That's Apple, TuneIn, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, anywhere that you listen to podcasts, you can find it. Just look up Catholic Conversations and subscribe, and you'll receive it every week. And we're playing with trying to decide on whether to release on Mondays or Fridays. Let me know what works better for you. So right now we're trying out Mondays, and we may move back to Fridays if that's what people like. Also follow me on Instagram, Twitter at FFONZE. That's FFonzie. And that's my Twitter and Instagram handle.
He's cool.
I know, right? And then also any the questions, comments, concerns, soapboxes, negativities, positivities, anything like that. You can reach me at fonsecaproduction@gmail.com. That's FONSECA production@gmail.com. That's production with no S at gmail.com. And thank you very much, Joseph. We're going to close out in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Santa Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
O juventutem